the stories are still not well told and not well known. Respecting immigrants and understanding why they're here.
We are establishing something new. We are redefining what it means to be an American, an Asian American.
For 11,000 years, Asia and the American West Coast were strangers. At the end of the last ice age, melting glaciers and rising seas put 5,000 miles of open ocean between California and its nearest Asian neighbor. It was almost impossible for the two worlds to meet. But once they did, once the entire Pacific Rim was drawn to one small spot on the map, the Bay Area became one of the great crucibles of East and West on the planet. A center for Asian art, money, culture, and especially people. San Francisco and San Jose are more than a third Asian American. In Fremont and Daly City, they are the majority. Asian Americans have taken leadership roles in politics, technology, and education. It is now impossible to imagine the modern Bay Area without people from Asia. And just as impossible to imagine the racism, hatred, and violence they endured to stay here. For more than a century, the United States waged a feverish campaign to stop Asians from becoming part of America. And the wellspring of that hatred, the very capital of the anti-Asian campaign, was the San Francisco Bay Area. Even before the gold rush, Chinese immigrants were making a home in the Bay Area. Historian Connie Young-Yu.
You know, I found the Chinese were here much earlier. There was a Chinese fishing village. I interviewed a woman in her 90s who, you know, had some notes that her father wrote, and he said, my grandparents were here in 1840s.
In 1849, gold turned San Francisco into the most popular destination on the planet, and people in China had a direct route to the gold fields. It took a two-masted schooner as little as 4 weeks to sail from Shanghai to San Francisco. It could take 3 times as long for a ship from New York. Chinese, anxious to escape war and poverty in China, headed east. California promised a better life and money they could send home to their families. In San Francisco, the first wave of Chinese immigrants settled on the very best real estate.
As soon as they got off the boat, they pitched their tents, and that was Portsmouth Square. Portsmouth Square used to be the wharf. So the Chinese chose a wonderful, wonderful piece of property to settle in.
In 1852 alone, more than 20,000 Chinese immigrants came to San Francisco. When American miners arrived, the first thing they encountered was a thriving Chinatown. In the gold fields, they had to compete with Chinese miners. Resentment against non-whites began to grow. Chinese miners were driven off their claims. A tax on foreign miners drove some Chinese out of the business, but not out of California.
Some of them tried to open restaurants or laundries throughout the West. Some of them were chased out of towns. There are many, many instances where Chinese were expelled. There was not an exclusion law. There was just, town ordinances, no Chinese here.
In 1863, work began on the western end of the Transcontinental Railroad. But there was a problem. Most able-bodied American workers were digging for gold. There weren't enough men to lay track. The railroad companies turned to the Chinese. They worked hard, didn't complain, and paid for their own food, all for $1 a day. For railroad barons like Leland Stanford, Chinese labor was better than gold.
Leland Stanford was the largest employer of Chinese labor in U.S. history. He employed up to, the estimates are up to 12 to 15,000 over a short period of time. The story is that Leland Stanford built his university on the backs of Chinese railroad workers. That's how he made his fortune.
At times, 90% of the people building the railroads were Chinese. But when a photographer captured the celebration at the end, not a single Chinese worker was included. With the railroad complete, American tolerance for Chinese immigrants ended. The country was in an economic depression and jobs were scarce. When thousands of now unemployed Chinese returned to the Bay Area, they became a target. Anti-Chinese propaganda appeared in newspapers and magazines. They were marked as criminals, disease carriers, and drug addicts. New laws prevented them from becoming citizens, from owning land, and from testifying against white people in court. In 1877, an anti-Chinese mob led by Irish laborers rioted in San Francisco's Chinatown. Political cartoonists imagined a wall to hold back the so-called Yellow Peril.
All the agitation led to the Congress convening their meetings in San Francisco. It was to discuss the Chinese question, people who really wanted the Chinese out.
In May of 1882, President Chester A. Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It prohibited any more Chinese people from entering the United States.
This is the first time, the only time in history, when the U.S. government declared a race of people ineligible for citizenship.
After the Exclusion Act, violence against the Chinese intensified across the West. Vigilante gangs killed scores of Chinese workers. In the Bay Area, arsonists targeted San Jose's Chinatown.
Over a period of years, there were 5 Chinatowns in San Jose. The first one was burned to the ground, the Market Street Chinatown. The largest Chinatown in San Jose was burned to the ground by arson May 4th, 1887.
The Exclusion Act did its job. The Chinese population in the U.S. began to decline. Jobs essential to the California economy went unfilled. The state needed construction workers and field hands.
In the 1890s, Japanese laborers began immigrating in numbers, and they took over where the Chinese left off.
In 1910, Angel Island became the first stop for hundreds of thousands of Asian immigrants coming to the San Francisco Bay Area. They were detained for days, sometimes months, and would undergo rigorous interrogation. They carved messages of fear and frustration into the barrack walls. Japanese immigrants got the same treatment as the Chinese. In San Francisco, the Anti-Jap Laundry League tried to drive laundries out of business. State and federal lawmakers slowly chipped away at Japanese freedoms. But the worst was still ahead. In 1941, the country of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 2,400 Americans died. 9 battleships were damaged or destroyed.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
With Executive Order 9066, President Roosevelt ordered all Japanese along the West Coast into internment camps. More than 110,000 Japanese Americans were herded into transport centers like the Tanforan racetrack in San Bruno. From there, they were shipped to isolated camps across the West. They lost their jobs, their homes. Few resisted, and those who did were hunted down. By the end of World War II, Asian immigrants had endured nearly a century of oppression, and yet they persevered, led by people who believed in a country that had refused to believe in them. The Bay Area welder who spent his life fighting the injustice of internment and won thanks to an improbable, unthinkable discovery. A man who cheated death to reach America, where he started one of the most successful bakeries in the country. A Vietnamese refugee who invented a noodle dish so popular, she keeps the recipe hidden in a secret kitchen. And the Indian boy with a head for math, who became an American billionaire because he heard a voice from the moon.
I'm prisoner of war number 32886C. That's my tag as an individual. And every person had a enemy alien number.
Former Congressman Mike Honda spent nearly 40 years in politics, in the South Bay, California, and Congress. Honda has fought for civil rights since he was a young boy.
We lived in Walnut Grove, which is a farming community right near Sacramento. And because of evacuation order 9066, my mother used to go out early and cut vegetables and try to raise as much cash as she can to take with her.
Honda was just 1 year old when his family was sent to the Amachi internment camp in Colorado. Honda's father was recruited to teach American soldiers Japanese, but that didn't change the family's situation. They were still prisoners, and his father didn't let Honda forget that.
We were sent to camp for our own protection, Michael. If it were for our protection, then the question is, why were we inside the barbed wire and with machine gun posts at every corner pointing in?
World War II ended and internment camps closed. Honda and his family moved back to the Bay Area in 1953 and settled in San Jose.
Alien land laws and things like that did not allow Asians to own land. There were people who could not own land unless they're citizens. And there were laws against naturalization of Asians.
Hollywood was using derogatory terms to describe Japanese people.
It happened to involve John Wayne and his movie called Sansa Iwo Jima. I saw that movie 3 times in one city.
I got a couple of bottles of sake in my gear. Break it out and give it to the squad. Right. Tell them you got it off a dead net.
I used that term, and my father heard me, and he called me over to counsel me. And from that point on, I started to understand terminologies that were not appropriate.
The controversy over internment camps festered in America's psyche for 40 years.
The lesson of internment should be taught. When they incarcerated all of us, the military found out they had no one that could speak Japanese outside. So they went in and recruited these volunteers. One wanted to prove their citizenship and their loyalty to this country by actively serving and volunteering the services. What hasn't been heard too much about is those who resisted the draft. I will not serve until you release my parents, because you want me to defend this country and the Constitution, and yet you set it aside on us.
January 30th is Fred Korematsu Day in California. In 2010, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger signed the bill making it the first statewide day in U.S. history named after an Asian American. Fred Korematsu was born in Oakland. At the time of World War II, Korematsu was a welder and worked at the docks. When Japanese Americans were being rounded up, Fred disobeyed military orders. Civil rights attorney Dale Minami.
He changed his name on his driver's license. He had minor plastic surgery done. He pretended to be from Hawaii. He didn't do a good forgery job on his driver's license, and plastic surgery was not perhaps the best. But so he was captured just outside of a drugstore, buying cigarettes.
Police arrested Korematsu in 1942 and he was sent to a camp in Topaz, Utah. Korematsu appealed his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing the forced internment of Japanese Americans was unconstitutional. But the court sided with the government.
He was, if you would describe it in another way, a stubborn man. A man who insisted on being treated like any other Americans, which is why he brought this case, why he fought again after losing 40 years before.
Dale Minami made a name for himself arguing civil rights cases in San Francisco. But nothing prepared him for a call he got in 1981 from UC San Diego professor Peter Irons.
And he said that we have even documents from the government lawyers who admit they're lying to the Supreme Court about the rationale for imprisoning Japanese Americans. How often do you find smoking guns in a legal case?
With those documents in hand, Minami led a team of pro bono attorneys to reopen Fred Korematsu's case.
We had to retry history. Of course, there are self-doubts because we brought this case in the middle of the redress movement by Japanese Americans to seek an apology and monetary payments. So the stakes were quite high.
November 10th, 1983. Dale Minami argued the new evidence in a San Francisco federal courtroom. The evidence was so powerful, the judge made her decision that same day, overturning the conviction of Fred Korematsu.
She actually found there was misconduct by the United States government that would have changed the decisions in 1943 and 44, that there was no military necessity to imprison Japanese Americans en masse. I was standing next to Fred, and there was this huge chill that went through my body. And I looked at Fred, and I said, Fred, this is great. And Fred, who had gone through this for 40 years and bearing the burden of the case that sent his people to prison, looked about 2 feet over my head with a blank stare and said, what happened? I said, you won, Fred, you won. And with that same look, he said, that's good.
In 1989, Korematsu received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Fred Korematsu died of respiratory failure in 2005 at the age of 86. Minami says the Korematsu case removed a cloud from a community that felt shameful and guilty about being forced to go to prison. Despite internment, hardship, and exclusion, the Bay Area remains the gateway to America for Asian immigrants, even if it means dying in the attempt.
Life is so precious. It was unfortunate that, many people got killed.
Another influential politician in the Bay Area was San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee. For more on his legacy, go to NBCBayArea.com/revelations.
young age, we encounter a lot of killing in front of us. We walked to school, we saw people being hung on the tree, the body dismembered. So it was very tough at the time.
Andrew Lee and his family lived in Vietnam when communists took over the country. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, the family tried 3 times to escape, but failed.
At that time, the communists knew that we tried to get away from escape. So they chased after us and they started shooting at us. And then one companion, young girl, ran with me in the jungle and she was shot dead beside me.
In 1978, the Lee family sold their valuables and bought their way onto a small boat with 140 other people. During the journey, they were attacked by pirates. They nearly ran out of water, and Lee saw refugee bodies floating in the ocean. But their boat finally made it to a refugee camp in Malaysia.
We talked with the Catholic charity. They helped us to stay here. And we feel lucky because in Vietnam, back in Vietnam, we knew that, San Francisco, California is a gold mountain. So we thought it was a street paved with gold, but when we came here, no, there was no gold.
In 1979, Lee and his 4 brothers reunited in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, living in a 1-bedroom apartment.
A lot of crimes and a lot of prostitutions, and we lived there with a small apartment with a lot of people. It was very tough. Did not speak English, did not have any monies, but still better than Vietnam during the war.
Lee took English classes during the day and worked as a newspaper carrier at night. And when he wasn't working, Lee was making donuts.
One of my brothers who was younger than me tried to make those Chinese donuts and at the home kitchen. And I lived with him at the time. Then he tried to deliver to Chinatown shop and this market. And at that time, nobody made that kind of donuts, the Chinese donuts.
In 5 years, the Lee family had saved $40,000 to start a new business.
So back in 1984, there was a small coffee shop at the corner of Balboa and 38th Avenue in San Francisco was for sale. And then my brother said, you know what, why don't we just buy that coffee shop? And then we make the Chinese donut there. And that's how we commercialize our Chinese donut.
In 1993, a breakthrough.
When the hotel industry in San Francisco decided to buy pastry from outside instead of making their own, that was a lucky break for us. So we decided to call on hotels, and then we sell muffin, croissant, donuts, and donuts to those hotels, and that's how we expanded.
Today, Sugar Bowl Bakery, one of the largest food manufacturers in the Bay Area, employs 400 people. Its pastries, madeleines, brownie bites, and petite pommiers are sold in stores worldwide. Costco, Safeway, and Starbucks are some of the biggest retailers selling what the Lee brothers are making. Lee's success got the attention of President Obama during a visit to San Francisco in 2013.
Andrew says, we came here as boat people, so we don't take things for granted. We know this is the best country in the world if you work hard.
We did not have a goal that how big we could go for, but we just keep on doing better and better every day.
Helene An was born in Vietnam in the northern province of Quien An. She's the youngest of 17 children. Her father was an advisor of the royal court. Helene lived the life of a princess.
I'm very lucky. When I was young, and I surrounded with many people take care of me. I have to say I'm a spoiled girl.
As a child, An would spend hours in the kitchen with the family's 3 chefs as they prepared meals for dignitaries.
My mom, she say, you don't have to do cooking. I want you to go to school. But when you get home, you have to go to the kitchen, watch the people working, and see how they cook. And then your job is to taste the food.
By 1975, Helene An had survived 20 years of war, married a South Vietnamese colonel, and had 3 daughters. But her life of privilege ended with a knock on the door. Saigon was falling to the North Vietnamese. She had to evacuate.
That time, I just grabbed my children.
Next thing I know, I'm sitting in this airplane with no seats. So it turns out it's a U.S. cargo plane, and it's really, really noisy. And I remember being really uncomfortable, and I'm sorry, Mom, I threw up on her, I think, many times.
Helene and her daughters would meet up with her husband at a refugee camp in the Philippines. From there, they started their journey to the Bay Area. Helene's mother-in-law, Diana, came to San Francisco before Saigon fell. She bought an Italian deli in the city's outer Sunset District.
Only on counter with about 10 people, and we live across the street. So my parents, they don't have that much money, so I have to help her to manage the restaurant.
For the first time in her life, Helene had to work to make money. She now had 5 daughters, 2 day jobs, and cooked at the restaurant at night. In 1971, the An family expanded the deli and changed it to Tang Long, one of the oldest Vietnamese restaurants in San Francisco.
After school, we would run to Tang Long and watch my mom and dad, my grandparents cook. Tang Long became my playground.
Helene became Chef An, creating her own healthy cuisine, including a famous dish inspired by spaghetti.
Everybody loves pasta. So in my mind, why everybody loves pasta? So I think, why I don't create something similar like Italian pasta?
I would just remember, like, in grade school back then, like, garlic noodles were already pretty popular. And so one of my girlfriends came up to me and said, hey, so is garlic noodles a traditional Vietnamese dish? And I was like, I'm not sure. Let me go home and ask my mom. And then I went home and asked my mom, and she's like, nope, I created it.
People lined up for Chef An's roasted crab and garlic noodles.
One of the things that made us realize how popular we were was that we would have, like, Eric Estrada came in, right? He was in Chips. Yes. And then Danny Glover came in. Yeah. And to our little hole-in-the-wall restaurant.
I even have a picture of me, like, being 5 years old sitting on Jack Nicholson's lap. I mean, I don't even know if he remembers that moment, but I did.
To protect her famous noodle and crab recipes, Chef An created a secret kitchen. It's a second kitchen in the restaurant that protects An's legacy. Only family members and long-term employees can enter.
I don't want anybody to know about my creation because I want to give them some knowledge. So I passed that idea and my creation to my daughter.
Chef An is still cooking at 70 years old. Her 5 daughters help manage the family's 6 restaurants in California.
The Smithsonian Museum, they created a Vietnamese American wing, and they actually honored our family for bringing Vietnamese food to mainstream America. And I remember thinking, like, wow, you know, I have overlooked all of this because we just grew up with this. But here's someone that's honoring my mother, my sisters, and my family for bringing Vietnamese food to mainstream America.
Asian Americans in the Bay were leading the way in innovation before Silicon Valley even existed. A Filipino American created technology most of the world uses every day.
Is this real? Is this something that I'm just dreaming about? And so on, because it was amazing how it took off.
Check out Chef Helene An, Cooking in the Kitchen, and get her shaken beef recipe on NBCBayArea.com/recipe. Revelations. Dado Banatao is a soft-spoken, humble man who likes simplicity. He is also a revolutionary innovator who made the modern personal computer possible. He grew up in the Philippines. His father was a rice farmer and his mother was a housekeeper. Every day he walked to school on a dirt road, often without shoes.
There are occasions where we have slippers, but slippers get ruined after a while.
Dado excelled in math and science. His favorite class in high school was in the lab because he could design things.
Our favorite was design a radio every time we were in the lab, and we blast each other with volume, of course. I thought that was so fun to be able to put things together, components together, and actually hear the result of your design, which is a basic radio.
After graduation, Dado trained as a pilot for Philippine Airlines. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was a job. In 1968, Boeing was looking for design engineers for their 747 project. He got the job and came to the United States. Banatao realized he needed more schooling to become a design engineer. He left Boeing and went to graduate school at Stanford. During that time, he met Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak.
That was the Homebrew Computer Club. And coming out of electrical engineering and computer science, it was just perfect for me to join the club. I had other classmates who were with me, but a lot of them already were industry, and there were the two Steves there already playing around with things.
In 1972, Banatao graduated from Stanford and went to work. At National Semiconductor, he showed people how to use a computer to design a computer. At Commodore, he developed the first single chip for a calculator. In 1981, IBM released its first personal computer. IBM needed 150 chips to make the PC. Dado took it apart and did it better.
I put together my own architecture and design with the Intel CPU, and I ended up with 3 big chips only, with very, very few little parts, and that was it. It just took off.
Dado Banatao didn't know how much he was changing the world until he was on vacation in a remote town in Spain. Even he was amazed at what he saw in a private home.
In one corner, he had a small table, and on top of it is a computer. And it is the computer where my parts were in. It's the PC. In a very remote place in the world, I realized, oh my God, this is really what happened, that I had something to do with it. I was just so happy, basically. In a remote place in some part of the world, there's this PC that I designed, the parts.
With his success, Banatao started giving back. He built a computer center at his grade school in his childhood town. Dado also gives college scholarships to students in the Philippines and Filipino Americans in California.
There's nothing more satisfactory, I think, than doing that in life, especially when you have something to offer.
Sometimes a small opportunity makes all the difference. A boy from Bombay came to the U.S. with $50 and changed the world of finance.
And I was surrounded by the legends of Wall Street. So they asked me, they said, okay, tell us how you're going to do this.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I was listening to the Voice of America broadcast the moon landing live all the way to Bombay, and I said to myself, wow, what brilliance, what courage, what perseverance, and I decided I wanted to be one of them.
Even as a child in India, Vivek Ranadive knew education was his fastest path to America. In high school, he saw a documentary about MIT and wanted to apply. MIT accepted him, but he needed money. In those days, it was difficult to convert rupees to the US dollar. The only way he could get American money was to get permission from the Central Bank of India.
They said that I didn't have an appointment, but I said I was going to wait. So I just hung out there the whole day, and at the end of the day, the central bank head got up to leave his office, and he saw a young boy sitting outside, literally camped outside his office, and he finally took pity and said, "Okay, I'll talk to you."
Ranadive got the money, went to MIT, and then Harvard Business School. While in school, Vivek wrote software that simplified the way brokers traded stocks. He talked his way into a morning meeting with the CEO of Goldman Sachs and other big Wall Street names.
I started talking, and the door opened and a guy walked in. And so they waved me off and said, "Keep going." So I started talking again, and the door opened and the guy walked in again. And the third time it happened, the elder gentleman in the room who was sitting next to me, he tapped me on the shoulder, and his name was Bob Mnuchin, and his son Steve is now the Treasury Secretary. And he said, "Son, you got to stop tapping your feet." So I was so nervous that I would keep tapping my feet like that. And every time I did that, there was a switch under the carpet that would summon the waiter. So that was my first day as an entrepreneur. We went on to have great success, not just with Goldman, but pretty soon we had automated just about every bank in the world.
Ranadive founded Tibco Software in 1997. If you've ever tracked a FedEx package, ordered an Uber, or bought an e-ticket, you've used software pioneered by Vivek Ranadive. His math skills even helped Ranadive solve a problem when his 12-year-old daughter asked him to coach a basketball team. Ranadive didn't know basketball, but he knew numbers. And the key to winning was to hold on to the ball.
If you got a certain number of turnovers, you would almost be guaranteed to win every game. We won every game, and we took the team to the national championship.
That was only the beginning of Ranadive's influence in basketball. In 2010, he became vice chairman of the Golden State Warriors. Ranadive sold his shares of the Warriors and bought the Sacramento Kings in 2013. He's the first Indian-American team owner in the NBA. Off the court, the Silicon Valley entrepreneur is looking for ideas that will change the world.
With Bow Capital, BOW, it stands for Better Our World. I wanted to create a new kind of investment fund. Most of these companies will be rooted in technology, and the largest research platform in the country is the UC system. I want to find those companies that will touch 1 billion people.
Asian immigrants spent the first 100 years in America just trying to survive. What they had to do next was try to reclaim their identity.
I remember when I was a graduate student, there was a sociology textbook which put minorities in the chapter called deviants.
Elaine Kim grew up in the Washington, D.C. area in the 1940s and 50s. She struggled with her ethnic identity as a Korean American.
People always asked me if I was Chinese or Japanese, and as if there could be no other possibility. I was made to think of myself as a foreigner from the time I entered school.
On her first day of grade school, Kim says her teacher told her to get in front of the class and tell the other students what she was.
I said I was a little girl, and she said, no, tell them what you are. Then I realized that she was She wanted me to say that I was Korean, but that didn't make much difference because nobody knew what Korean was.
Kim didn't feel like she belonged anywhere. She carried that feeling through her teenage years and into college at Penn State. In 1968, Kim came to UC Berkeley for graduate school. She arrived at a time of intense political upheaval. Students launched a 5-month strike, protesting a lack of diversity in courses and faculty.
If you look at the buildings at UC Berkeley, many of them are named after famous racists. And the racism in California was mostly anti-Asian racism because there were fewer African Americans here at that time. Bolt Hall, Barrows Hall, Bancroft Library, Warren Hall, all of those buildings are named after fabulously racist people.
Kim's life was about to change. She was invited to a meeting with the Asian American Political Alliance.
That's the first time somebody had sought me out in a positive way as an Asian American, and that's where I first began to meet Asian Americans, and they talked about things that were very resonant for me, like the absence of Asian American in public life, in textbooks, on media.
In 1969, Kim was hired as one of the first people to teach Asian American studies at Cal. In addition to teaching, she gave the department structure and direction. Now a master educator, Elaine Kim turned her attention to her community. She co-founded the Korean Community Center of the East Bay.
I and other Korean Americans wanted to organize and serve the Korean immigrant community. That was why we tried to start the Korean Community Center in 1977. It was very rewarding for me to work for KCCB, and I consider that one of the gifts I received in life.
Kim retired from teaching in 2015. She continues to work with organizations that serve Asian women and immigrants, but the lesson remains the same.
So there's no Korean Community Center, we need to create one. There's no Asian American Women's Group, we will create one. There are no books on this or that topic, so we will write them.
And when words are not enough, art takes over.
You know, the first time I put a mark on a wall changed my life.
It's one of the most beautiful and oldest traditional Japanese gardens in the nation. The gardener who made Hakone Gardens in Saratoga a national treasure. The story on NBCBayArea.com/revelations. There are some stories that words can't tell. That's why we have artists. Ruth Asawa used sculptures to tell the Asian American story. She moved to San Francisco in the 1950s after surviving internment camp. She became famous for her wire sculptures. Her work is in museums around the world, including the De Young in San Francisco. Her creations are seen every day on the streets of San Francisco. The fountains in Ghirardelli Square and Union Square. Ruth Asawa was known as the Fountain Lady. She wanted to inspire other young artists and helped create the San Francisco School of Arts. After her death, it was named the Ruth Asawa School of Arts. Elaine Chu and Marina Perez Wong were born and raised in San Francisco. At the age of 14, the two met at the school Ruth Asawa helped create. They fell in love with painting in different ways.
I had cancer as a child. It's called a Wilms tumor. 1 out of every 1 million babies gets it. But my mom says that I learned how to paint in the hospital, sort of as a kind of product of me not being able to communicate verbally.
My mom had a liquor store in the Tenderloin, so I would go there and hang out after school, and she realized that I liked to draw, so she always brought me, you know, crayons, and so I would draw on all the grocery bags.
At the School of Arts, Ruth Asawa inspired them to get serious.
That was the first place I realized that you could do art and make a living, and also learned different forms of art.
Her artwork later was amazing to see in the De Young Museum. It was the first time I saw, Bay Area Asian woman artist that was in a monumental space.
Elaine and Marina became best friends at school and have painted together ever since. They have painted several walls around San Francisco, including Hemlock Alley in the Tenderloin.
It's that kind of little kid border where you're playing and you're dreaming, but you want it to be a reality too. So, and that's why it's called the Hope Act.
What does a dragon represent, for Chinese? Also a kite, like what does a kite mean? So the kite kind of represented this letting go and hope for a future. And so trying to find those little symbolisms and imagery that reflect being Chinese.
In 2013, they co-founded the Twin Walls Mural Company in San Francisco.
Everybody can enjoy a mural, from like the person that walks by when you're painting to 10 years down the line, somebody can still enjoy it.
Elaine now mentors young artists in the Mission District, and Marina teaches at the Oakland School of Arts. Together, they are passing along a strong Asian American influence in street art.
It means a lot for people to see that we're out there and we're doing it, and we have a strong community that's going to continue to grow and teach the younger generation.
The people of Asia have influenced just about every aspect of the Bay Area.
We are migrants. We come to a place to prove something.
The Asian people always want to make sure that they go to the right place to make a better living.
Despite being vilified, denied jobs, and excluded, many Asian immigrants believed the Bay Area was their best hope for a better life.
Over time, people found this place as an accepting place. People take pride in being here now rather than being isolated.
Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, Indian, every Asian culture has helped shape today's Bay Area.
It's got an energy like no other place, and anybody can achieve anything. Anything is possible in the Bay Area.
And after generations of oppression, Asian Americans in the Bay Area have achieved a remarkable level of political and economic power.
We really feel comfortable with what has been created here.
I think you have a sense of pride in being who you are. To me, it's a good thing to be an Asian American in this area.
We're here to stay. We're here to make it our home. We're here to make it something that the city can be proud of. We're very proud of being Asian Americans.
On the next Bay Area Revelations.
And there's a long drive to left field, and you can tell that one goodbye.
A home for heroes. Some of the biggest names in the history of baseball have called the Bay Area home. The untold stories of the moments that made them champions. Coming this summer on Bay Area Revelations. You can watch the full episode of this show online at nbcbayarea.com/revelations.